which is what he's used to doing. Betsy Woodruff, let's look at these polls. New polls show that just over half of all Americans believe that the president's to blame for the government shutdown. It also says it's taking a toll on Donald Trump's standing with the public. This month's Gallup poll finds the president's approval rating is down to 37%, his worst rating in a year, with 59% disapproving. Among independents, Trump has dropped to a 31% approval rating, dropping 8 points since December. In a Quinnipiac poll, only 33% of voters approve strongly, while 8% only approve somewhat. Meanwhile, 50% disapprove strongly and 5% disapprove somewhat. The poll also found that the rating of President Trump's handling of the economy is dropping. 49% approve, 48% disapprove. That's the highest disapproval for his job on the economy since his first 7 weeks in office. And a majority of voters do not think Donald Trump is fit to serve as president. 53% of voters saying no, 44% saying yes. 57% of independent voters find Trump unfit to serve.
And we get 2 other quick data points. First, Donald Trump is the only president in the history of polling to never go above 50% his first 2 years in office. His numbers have been abysmal, and he has set the record for the worst 2 years in the history of American polling. That's number one. And number two, get this, and Republicans should get this too, with all of their fear-mongering on the border. Americans actually believe Democrats can do a better job securing the border than Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
So, Betsy Woodruff, take your pick. Damage to the Republican Party, damage to the presidency, and potential impact with these numbers to trying to get this government reopened again.
These kind of numbers cause a lot of anxiety for the people who are working on Trump's 2020 re-election bid. One data point from the Quinnipiac poll you referred to that I found really striking when I was reviewing the numbers this morning. We remember the big speech that Trump gave about a week ago where he took a time on all the broadcast networks and rolled out his case for the wall. He said a lot of things that were incorrect and misleading. It was a demagogic address, and it was something that was really important to the White House. It was how they were making the case for this shutdown that's really been devastating to so many hundreds of thousands of Americans. Quinnipiac found that after that speech, that huge pivotal effort, only 2% of Americans changed their thinking about this wall. It basically had no effect, a negligible effect at all. That was their Hail Mary, and it didn't succeed. Another number from these polls that's important: the last screen that you showed up on air showed that less than 10% of Democrats think Trump is fit to be president. That might not sound surprising, but that number is actually important to people working on Trump's re-election campaign, in part because part of the reason that he won in 2016 was that he did so well in Democratic strongholds, states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, where historically Democrats are successful. Trump does not have a road back to the White House in 2020 unless he can peel off some of those traditional Democratic voters. And if the cohort of people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, who played a key role in making him president in the first place, are right now looking at this shutdown and thinking maybe we made the wrong choice, that's a big problem for his re-election bid. And I can tell you those numbers are being taken seriously by the people in the president's orbit.
Absolutely.
So, Betsy, try to explain for us, our viewers, if you can, why is it that Republicans are willing to break with Donald Trump when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to NATO, when it comes to Russia? But when it comes to this government shutdown that's having a devastating impact on a lot of people in their own districts, a devastating impact on Republican poll numbers, a devastating impact on the president's poll numbers, they're not willing to move?
It's a really good question. I don't know that there's an easy answer for that. I think perhaps part of it is that the president has been so aggressive and vocal about this shutdown. We do know that many of the Republican senators and members of Congress who who live in very Trump-friendly districts and states are quite sensitive to Trump on the issues that he's the most vocal about. Remember, Trump has yet to actually vocally, publicly say that he thinks the United States should pull out of NATO. And even though he's made his points clear, or his view clear about some of these sanctions, particularly on Russian oligarchs, he hasn't really been working the phones on Capitol Hill when it comes to that question. We've got a big story out this morning about the sanctions on Oleg Deripaska, who, of course, is an ally of Paul Manafort's, a very close ally of Vladimir Putin's, one of Russia's richest men. The Senate voted yesterday to take the first procedural step to keep sanctions in place on Deripaska, despite the fact that the Treasury Department is trying to take those sanctions off of these two or three companies that Deripaska is closely connected to. And Republicans are part of the reason that the Senate took that procedural step, because a number of Republicans peeled off, broke ranks with Treasury, despite the fact that the Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin was on the Hill having meetings with Republicans about trying to make the case to keep sanctions, to take sanctions off of these Deripaska companies. On these issues where Trump himself isn't making a ton of noise, where he's not sending lots of tweets, where he's not making it key campaign issues, the issues where perhaps Trump may feel a little bit shy, a little bit uncomfortable with his views, especially on the Russia question, we see Republicans breaking ranks. But when it comes to this shutdown, of course, thus far, it's only a few Republicans who are peeling off.
All right,
Wow.
Betsy, thank you so much.
Thank
we
you,
greatly
Betsy.
appreciate it. And, you know, Mika, again, this is a shutdown that's about nothing. Just a couple of weeks ago, Republicans voted with Democrats unanimously to keep the government open and to move the debate forward. And here you have, again, people suffering all across America, and the United States government shut down, and our economy. People inside the White House saying this could hurt the United States economy, all over a shutdown about nothing, about a wall that Republicans didn't even want up until 2 weeks ago.
Sounds like a Trump business in the months before bankruptcy. Still ahead on Morning Joe. Sure, William Barr broke with President Trump over the quote-unquote witch hunt, but there were several key areas where the president's pick for attorney general said things about the Russia probe that would be welcomed by the White House. Plus, 2 more Senate Democrats jump into the presidential fray. We'll tell you what Kirsten Gillibrand and Sherrod Brown have planned. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.